And I'm really excited to have the chance to share with you, and also to have a conversation and to have some fun. So let's get to it. Thanks. So what I'll start with is just some background about this research, so you understand why I've become such a big believer in nonprofit networks and this leadership approach. And I can assure you, this isn't something that I dreamt up sitting alone in the ivory tower and I thought, oh, everybody should just do networks and people should listen to me, and that's why I do what I do now. It really came about through an evolution of my own thinking, where I started this research in early 2000. This was on the heels of the first .com boom, and I had done my doctorate at Stanford, so there was a lot of energy and excitement in Silicon Valley about growth and scale, and how do we get some of this innovation that's happening in the technology field applied to social impact work? How can we grow those ideas and grow those organizations to scale and solve the world's problems? And that's kind of where the field was when I started doing this research. And I was trying to figure out how could I best be helpful in supporting practitioners to do their work to meet their missions. And what was quite interesting was there was such an interest in innovation, starting new enterprises, growing them to scale. And at the same time, I was teaching every year in our executive education programs. And we would have senior executives from leading nonprofits from all over the world, Boys and Girls Clubs, Red Cross, the United Way, Habitat for Humanity, Nature Conservancy, a lot of large global NGOs, international, World Wildlife Fund. They would come through our executive education programs, and a lot of these executives were struggling also. And they were talking about, we are struggling with how to get headquarters to get along with field offices, how to get innovation that's happening in one area in our operations spread to the rest of our organization. How do we coordinate activities across our various units? So there was a lot of struggle, not only for the very small nonprofits that had a great idea and innovation that they wanted to get out into the world, even the very large, successful nonprofits that had the biggest budgets, the biggest brand names, the biggest brand recognition. They couldn't necessarily achieve their mission impact either. And so I began thinking or wondering, is growth really the only path to getting to mission impact? And as I was doing research for an MBA class I was teaching on social entrepreneurship, I came across a few examples of network leadership. And it was almost just by accident that I came across these cases that were so different and so interesting and inspiring to me, because here there were examples of leaders who, instead of focusing on how to grow, how to scale, how to get more power and resources into their own institutions, instead focusing on the mission first and how to invest in building the field as a whole, how to lift up even their competitors so that they could invest in growing the capacity of the field itself in order to solve the problem, and really building a system of connections, a network, to really enable the field to together solve those problems more effectively. And so there were a few examples that really inspired me and put me onto this path of focusing on those types of examples and understanding what do they have in common and what can we learn from those examples and apply them to other contexts where we're struggling to get greater mission impact. So that's really kind of the story of my career in a nutshell, because then for the last 20 years, I've really been focusing on a range of leading edge nonprofit networks and studying those examples across a range of different fields, everything from economic development to education reform, to international development, to animal rescue organizations, to housing organizations, art organizations, environmental conservation, you name it. There's just been a range of different types of issue areas. But what's been fascinating is that despite the differences in the issues that these organizations face, they all face the similar challenge of a huge scale as far as the problem they're trying to solve or the mission that they're trying to achieve, and then a very small set of resources relative to the scale of that problem. Just virtually every organization faces that. And so what these networked leaders and networked organizations do is, again, a fundamentally different way of doing the work. And it's a focus on working with external partners and building a system for change rather than trying to do everything themselves and get all the resources in their organizations. And so what I found is across these various organizations, across the different issue areas, and some of these are very small grassroots organizations, others are larger.
Jane, if
yes.
you don't mind, can you just go a little slowly so that we can catch up?
Sure.
Because
okay.
Most of us we're not natives, so just really, I really
sure.
prefer everyone really just understand, digest the content.
Okay.
Really.
Yes,
I can see that you're very excited. I'm so sorry to disturb you. Please.
No, that's
please.
okay. I'm glad you told me. And I do have a tendency to say a lot and talk too much. So please feel free to jump in if it really is not clear or you have questions. I don't mind that at all. So across all of these different types of organizations, whether very large or very small organizations, whether they're foundations or small grassroots organizations operating at the field level, what I found is these network leaders and the network organizations, the networks they're a part of, share a common set of traits and values and principles. That's very much a robust set of principles that applies across all of them. And that's really what I've spent the bulk of my time over the last several years, is sharing these pearls of wisdom and trying to enable other people who are facing the same challenge of a huge mission with limited resources. How do you move the needle on that? And so often, again, our tendency is, well, we just need more resources, we need more staff, we need to build infrastructure, we need to build our organization. And only when our organization becomes a certain size will we be able to address the mission. And all of these organizations teach a very different lesson. And I think one thing that's remarkable that comes out from all of this is that despite their differences, these organizations have a lot in common. So let me just turn a moment to share what those commonalities are and explain those principles, and then we'll be able to discuss a little bit more about them. So again, this whole idea of, despite organizations being very different, the network principles are fundamentally the same. And that's what I've seen, and it's been very exciting to see, is that there is this common set of values or principles and a culture and a leadership approach that stands out. And I find that in all the cases that I've looked at, but perhaps even more compellingly, when I do conference speaking or meet nonprofit leaders or social entrepreneurs all over the world, there's always people who've worked in this way, and they didn't learn it from me. They've been working in this way because it was an intuitive way to get to the mission impact that they were after. And they came across other partners and like-minded, trusted partners and began working with them and began building a network and started to see the power of that and started to build the network. And so what I've seen is most people who are working in this way certainly didn't learn it from me. They've been doing this already. And indeed, the people that I've studied, they didn't learn it from me. They were doing it already. I've just taken all of their experience and learned from their wisdom and said, okay, what's the common factors that we can take to apply to other problems? So the 4 principles are quite straightforward, and I'll frame them in maybe the traditional managerial way that we tend to think about problems, and then the network approach, and contrast those so you can get a better idea. So the tendency in social impact work, or even in private sector work or in the government sector, is let's get our organization and our resources, kind of maximize those entities, and then we'll be able to solve the mission. And it's only through that infrastructure growth and programmatic expansion that we can get to mission impact. And the contrast is, in a networked mindset or a networked organization, the approach is, well, yes, the organization matters. We need to have our finances in order. We need to have great talent. We need to have good strategy and infrastructure within our organization. But the vehicle for actually achieving our goals is not just organization growth. It is actually a focus on the mission first and foremost, and that involves thinking outside the box, if you will, or outside the organization. That so often the way to meet our mission is not going to be just within our silo, but engaging and connecting with all of these other entities outside of our organization. So the willingness to let go of the institutional focus is absolutely central. And I've seen that time and time again. And I'll share an example with all of these principles. One of my favorite cases is the case of Habitat for Humanity in Egypt, which is a leading affiliate of the global Habitat for Humanity International program. So Habitat for Humanity International is the world's largest housing nonprofit, and their goal is to eliminate poverty housing in the world. And Habitat Egypt is a country program of that entity. And what I had the chance to study in documenting the work of Habitat for Humanity was this network model in practice in the country. They went from being a fledgling organization to investing in a network of indigenous community-based organizations to deliver the housing program. And then they started to work in this network way with trusted partners over many years and built a network of nearly a dozen partners. And then they became one of the most effective and efficient and sustainable habitat country programs globally, and built more houses and outpaced most all of their peers by working in this way, by working in this untraditional way. So Habitat for Humanity Egypt, for example, instead of focusing on how do we build our board and get more dollars into our organization and hire more staff, instead focused on what other community-based organizations are already in the field that are doing good work on community development, economic development, education, and health, some of the factors that actually drive poverty housing. And where do they have a gap in housing, and we can help fill that gap. So again, instead of building everything themselves, they found existing organizations that had a need for the housing, but had some expertise in some of the related areas that were contributing to poverty housing. So by working with these organizations, they started to invest in not only building local capacity in their peers, in their network partners, but also building staff capacity, training them, providing seed capital, and providing ongoing support to deliver a housing program. And so it was in this way that they could build up their organization's impact very quickly without necessarily building their own organization. So they went from building just a few houses per year to over 1,000 houses per year. And typically it would take a few, or maybe 5 or 10 years for country programs to get from startup to building houses in the double digits, but they were able to get to quadruple digits within a couple of years simply by working in this network way. Again, focusing on the mission first, poverty housing, and focusing on how can we get there without necessarily our own organization's growth. The next concept and principle in network leadership is this idea of trust rather than control. And again, the typical dynamic in organizations so often, whether again in private sector or in the nonprofit field, I certainly see this, is that there is a tendency to say, well, we have to have performance metrics and carrots and sticks to incentivize and punish the behavior that we want, incentivize the behavior we want, punish the behavior we don't want. We need to have very tight performance metrics and controls and tracking, and that's how we'll get to the mission. And controlling the process is really critical. What I found here with all of these network examples is that partners find trusted others, that they work very diligently at the outset to find organizations and peers that they can trust. And then they can let go of some of that control and say, you know, we're focusing on the mission together. I know you're not going to take advantage of our partnership and exploit my resources for your own benefit. I know we're going to focus on the mission together, and therefore I can trust you to take on more ownership and control of the effort. So again, in the Habitat Egypt example, what we saw was that instead of trying to run the entire program from Habitat's chain of command, Habitat identified trusted partners by spending many months in the field to identify existing nonprofits that had a very strong track record of serving the needs of the community, that they were actually very good at serving particularly the most marginalized people in their communities, so that they knew that this organization, this partner, was very committed to the mission above all else, that they weren't just trying to build their own power base, they weren't just trying to build their own fiefdom, but they were actually focused on the mission in their own communities. Once they started to see that ongoing commitment, Habitat would work with this partner and allow their partner to drive a lot of the programmatic design and delivery. So again, instead of Habitat controlling it all, they said, we trust you, we want to learn from you, we want to use your expertise to deliver this program as effectively as possible. Even if Habitat was providing the bulk of the financial capital, they wanted to get the expertise and the resources as far as the trust in the community, the understanding of the community needs. So they would customize the loan sizes or the duration of the loan for the local community based on what they learned from the community partner. They let their programmatic partner choose who to deliver the housing programs to, who would be eligible for the loans and the housing program. And what they found was their partners were doing a better job than what they could have done on their own. And the reason for that was because their partners knew the community that they were working with. They knew who they could select for the homeownership program and who was trustworthy. And therefore they got higher repayment rates and more houses built and a more locally customized program, because of their trust in their partner, rather than, again, saying, we're Habitat, we know what we're doing, we're experts at housing, you need to listen to us because we're providing the capital. So it was a very different dynamic. They were working much more as equals and as peers, rather than Habitat at the top and then their peers or their partners further down the hierarchy. So the next concept, which is related to this idea of the trust rather than control, is humility, and a degree of humility, not just when it comes to working and getting the spotlight and whether or not you get recognized, but a humility on all dimensions of the work. So again, this idea of there's never a smartest person in the room. Every organization, every person, every community member is bringing something that's valuable that can be helpful in solving the problem. And so again, Habitat is a world expert in housing programs and in addressing poverty housing, but they also knew they didn't necessarily have credibility in the community. They didn't necessarily have the relationships in the community. They didn't have local knowledge of the community, and they trusted their partners to bring that to them. And so in the case of Habitat Egypt, when it came time to celebrate their 6,000th house celebration, they had a big ceremony, and there were all these dignitaries and government officials and funders that were joining them in the celebration. And they invited Yosri Makar, who was the national director of Habitat Egypt, to join them on stage and get the recognition for their big accomplishment. And Yosri took the stage and he said, "This isn't Habitat. We are merely providing support." And he invited all of his peer network members to join him on the stage and get the recognition that they had all worked together to deliver. Because again, it might have been a really good opportunity for Habitat to fundraise for itself and get that recognition in that ceremony. But Yosri said, "I will never succeed in my mission if I only focus on building up Habitat. I need to lift up all of my partners, my entire network, and bring recognition to our collective work in order to get the work and the mission accomplished." And so he was very mindful and focused on building that reservoir of goodwill with his partners and being humble and saying, even though they provided the seed capital, even though they provided the expertise on the housing program and provided ongoing capacity support, they didn't pretend like they owned it or it was all about them. They were very mindful of encouraging and lifting up their peers and partners. Excuse me. And the last concept is this idea of building constellations rather than stars. So the people and the organizations that work in this networked way are very, very skilled at thinking about their work, not just through the lens of their own resources and the chain of command within their organization. Instead, they look at what's the big picture, what's the larger goal, and how do I engage others to connect around that goal and build this beautiful constellation of actors to move the needle and get to greater mission impact on that goal. So let me just share a slide that was from a colleague of mine who actually worked at Habitat doing leadership training in their organization. The traditional habitat model, and I know the font is very small, you don't have to be able to read all of that, or you don't have to get your eyes examined. I put two slides together so you could see the contrast. The traditional habitat model focuses on Habitat's general programmatic approach, which is making low to no interest loans for homeowners to build or renovate their homes. And then all of the other actors that are part of Habitat's network are arrayed around them. So you have churches, you have academia, you have financial institutions and social service agencies, other nonprofits, corporate sponsors, schools, government agencies, fraternal organizations, business professionals, civic groups, a range of different actors that all engage with Habitat to support that model. And the contrast is the network model and the network approach as applied to Habitat says, wait, our mission is at the center. Eliminating poverty housing is at the core of what we do. And Habitat is one part of the solution, but we're not the only solution. And there are all these other organizations that have resources and expertise that can be brought to bear. And in some cases, those organizations may have a program or an approach that's more appropriate in one community or another. And therefore, it's not that our program is one size fits all and always has to be the dominant model. It's more, we'll activate whatever connections and whatever resources as a network that makes sense and make the greatest impact on the mission. But it's not always going to be about Habitat at the center and everybody arraying around us. It's everybody arraying around the mission. And sometimes Habitat will take a backseat to some of their peers and even competitors in the social impact space, because they know it's not about their prominence. It's much more about building that constellation. And it's not just being that brightest star. So I think that slide is really beautiful for illustrating that contrast between the network mindset on the right and the more traditional managerial mindset on the left. So that's pretty much it. The 4 network principles that I've seen time and time again in my own research and again in practice when I'm meeting people at different conferences and they're sharing their work. And I can tell you the people who tend to be most excited about my own work and my research are the people who are already working in this way. And they say, oh my gosh, I've been working this way my whole career, or I've been trying to work in this way. And you've just helped me put language around what it is that I'm doing and how it's different from a more traditional organizational approach. And so all of these principles that are underlined, mission, trust, humility, and building constellations rather than stars, those are hallmarks of a successful network approach. And the challenge, of course, is that in most contexts, whether you're talking nonprofit, private sector, government, there's a focus on almost the opposite, that there's a focus on the organization and the power and the resources that that organization controls. There's an emphasis on command and control and systems and mechanisms to incentivize or punish certain behaviors, but you can't account for every contingency. So that trust element is actually really critical. And then again, there's a tendency in many cultures to focus on self-promotion and getting all the credit and getting the recognition for great work. But the reality is what we need is not just a few bright stars, but we need beautiful constellations of actors to really make a difference on the issues, the social issues that we as humanity face today. There's no single organization, no matter how well resourced, that's ever going to be able to move the needle on these challenges on their own. And so we need a different mindset, we need a different leadership approach in order to make a difference on those issues. And that requires focusing again on the underlying principles and less on the other norms that tend to dominate in so many organizations that we work with. So with that, I'll just turn it back to you and would love to hear questions